Akkad and Ebla, the collapse of Semitic civilization. Let's first remind ourselves of the origins of Semites in order for us to eventually get to their collapse. So early Proto-Semitic populations descend from Natufian, Harifian, and pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations. Early Proto-Semites have a Levantine origin, and they dispersed from the Levant in 4000 BC into Mesopotamia and Arabia. Culturally, Neolithic Levantines were the first pastoralists and agriculturalists. Early Semitic populations also practiced pastoralism and agriculture. Neolithic Levantines would have had haplogroup E, and therefore early Proto-Semites would have haplogroup E. The Natufians is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant, dating to around 15,000 through 11,500 years ago. The culture was unusual in that it supported a sedentary or semi-sedentary population, even before the introduction of agriculture. The Natufian communities may be the ancestors of the builders of the first Neolithic settlements of the region, which may have been the earliest in the world. So right off the gate, Natufians, they're the people who practiced agriculture and the first to build settlements in the Levant. According to Christy G. Turner II, there is an archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufian culture. And also, as I just read, various scientists actually subscribe to the Natufians being the ancestors of Semites, such as Christy G. Turner II, and there are many others. So here's the area of Natufian culture in question. Again, situated in the Levant, stretching from Sinai all the way up into modern-day Syria. And you can also see the area of Proto-Semitic people, which basically overlaps with the Natufian culture. Of course, this makes sense if Semites will spawn from the Natufians. According to the genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y haplogroup, Y DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat upwind clade of E-M123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops and thus the advent of agriculture. Again, Natufians, earliest people to basically be farmers. The discovery of E-Z830 without other clades suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel that predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. So here is a map that shows all of the haplogroup E clades of ancient times. These are ancient samples, and it perfectly overlaps with the area of Natufian culture. And this makes sense because Natufians had haplogroup E, and their descendants will have haplogroup E. Harifian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epipaleolithic of the Negev Desert. It corresponds to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. As you can see, this is a little bit later, 8,800 BCE through 8,000 BCE. So it's a little bit later, but still connected to the Natufians. Harifian has close connections with the late Mesolithic cultures of Phylum and the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resembles that of the Harifian. Fusion with animal domestication elements of the pre-pottery Neolithic bee culture is hypothesized by Jairus Zarians to have led to the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism and may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. And that is from the book Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlements of Lower Mesopotamia. And so basically, Proto-Semitic people could have spawned from these pre-pottery Neolithic B and Harefian cultures that would have created early pastoralism and domesticated animals. So here is the Harefian culture, as they said, is in Sinai, and here is the late Natufian and early pre-pottery Neolithic A, and eventually B and C, where it would have been concentrated. And as we can see in the southern Levant, you have a lot of these Neolithic sites where we will find a lot of these E samples as well, all concentrated here. So again, we are still dealing with the Levant, even when we're talking about pre-pottery Neolithic cultures as well as the Harefians. We're still dealing with the Levant. Pre-pottery Neolithic B is part of the pre-pottery Neolithic, a Neolithic culture centered in Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant. Like the earlier PPNA people, the PPNB culture developed from the Mesolithic Natufian culture. We cannot get away from the Natufians. Still, even when it comes to the pre-pottery Neolithic, we are still dealing with the descendants of the Natufians. Work at the site of En Ghazel in Jordan has indicated a later pre-pottery Neolithic C period, which existed between 8,200 and 7,900 BP. And as we can see, we're getting closer and closer to the period where Semites would eventually come from. We started with the Natufians, we're working our way on down. Jairus Zarians has proposed that a Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex developed in the period from the climactic crisis of 6,200 BC, particularly as a result of an increasing emphasis in PPNB cultures upon animal domesticates, and a fusion with Harefian hunter-gatherers in southern Palestine, with affiliate connections with the cultures of Phylum and the eastern desert of Egypt. Cultures practicing this lifestyle spread down the Red Sea shoreline and moved east from Syria into southern Iraq, which ironically kind of fits the migration patterns of Proto-Semites. So here again is the distribution of PPN sites. Again, it's pretty much no different than the area of Natufian culture because, well, PPNB populations are descendants of Natufians. And of course, here is the Harefian because we mentioned that in that study as well, and the late Natufian and early PPNA. So all basically dealing with the Levant. Again, stretching from Sinai all the way up into modern-day Syria, which would be near Upper Mesopotamia. So all of the same region. En Ghazel is a Neolithic archaeological site located in metropolitan Amman, Jordan. The settlements at En Ghazel, Spring of the Ghazel, first appeared in the middle pre-pottery Neolithic B. Y-DNA haplogroup E1B1B1B2 has been found in 75% of the En Ghazel population, along with 60% of PPNB populations, and is present in all three stages of PPNB and in most Natufians. So basically, we find haplogroup E in these PPNB populations, these pre-pottery Neolithic populations, at 60%, and we find it basically in all three stages of PPNB, as well as in En Ghazel, which is a middle PPNB population, and most Natufians, which of course makes sense. So haplogroup E is most definitely prevalent throughout the Levant and the pre-pottery Neolithic area, as well as in the Mesolithic Natufian era and later on. So here is all of the samples of E that I could find, and there's more. Here's the N Gazelle PPNB that we found in Jordan, right here. Here is the Pekin Cave with an E sample. Here is the Natufian samples here in northern Israel. And here's even an E sample in Chalcolithic or Copper Age Turkey or Anatolia. So again, haplogroup E is found throughout this time period where the first people are beginning to develop agriculture in the Levant, carrying these E markers, and domesticating animals carrying these E markers. More recently, Jairus Zarians has suggested that the development of a circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex of cultures developed in the period of the 6200 BCE climactic crisis stretching from southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and northeastward into Syria and Iraq, spread Proto-Semitic languages through the region. This complex may have developed from the fusion of Harifian and pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures in southern Palestine. Again, this is from early pastoral nomadicism and the settlements of Lower Mesopotamia. That's the name of the book. And Proto-Semitic people will descend from these Harifian pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures within the southern Levant. And of course, Harifian and pre-pottery B descends from who? They descend from the Natufians, all of which have the Y chromosome haplogroup E. This is why it makes the most sense for the early Proto-Semitic population to carry haplogroup E. Again, here is the late Natufian / early PPNA region, and here's the Harifian region. And here are all the sites, all the Neolithic sites in southern Palestine, in the southern Levant, and it stretches from the Negev and Sinai all the way up into modern-day Syria. Same thing with the Proto-Semitic homeland, stretching all the way in Sinai up into modern-day Syria. This video will illustrate the migration of Proto-Semites in 4000 BC from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. Now let's look at Ebla. Ebla was an Eastern Semitic civilization. Ebla exists in modern-day Syria, and Ebla's first kingdom was from 3000 through 2000 BC. Here is the city in question, Ebla, modern-day Syria, as I just said. And here's like a tablet, a nice artist rendition of how, it might look from an ancient perspective with a modern terminology. So, this is from the book Ebla and its Landscape. And it reads, following the still obscure centuries in the history of the first urban formations in Mesopotamia, to which the virtually unknown and certainly limited settlements of Marduk I of the proto-historic period, circa 3500 through 3000 BC, dates back. The true urban development of Ebla probably took place during the early dynastic 1 through 3 periods of Mesopotamia, corresponding to the ages of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. In the still partly obscure phase of Marduk IIIA, circa 3000 through 2400 BC, corresponding to the archaic early Syrian period, early Bronze Age 1 through 3. The first flourishing of Ebla took place during Marduk IIb1, the age of the royal archives, circa 2400 through 2300 BC, and the high early Syrian period, EB, early Bronze Age 4a, corresponding to the last decades of the early dynastic 3 period. So now let's deal with the language of Ebla. Until the discovery of the Eblite tablets, there was no reason to focus inquiry on the structure of East Semitic, since the only language assigned to that group was Akkadian, and Akkadian / East Semitic was what was left out of West Semitic. This treatment of Ebelite as an East-Semitic sibling of Akkadian is compatible with that of Kapleis, 1981, who suggests that Ebelite was neither Akkadian nor West Semitic, and that of Gleb, who suggested that the closest relative of Ebelite is Old Akkadian, without treating it as a dialect of Akkadian. So basically, Ebelite is, its closest relative is the Old Akkadian language. And this is from the book, The Semitic Languages. So Ebla existed from 3000 through 2000 BC. Genetically, we've actually found haplogroup E in early Bronze Age Ebla in 2700 through 2500 BC. Haplogroup E is typically linked to Afro-Asiatic languages and the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages. And Ebelite, of course, is an Afro-Asiatic language. According to the ancient DNA analysis conducted by Segor Tenit et al. 2020 on 10 human remains from Tel Merdik, the inhabitants of the kingdom of Ebla were a mixture of Levantines, Iranians, and Anatolians. One early Bronze Age individual carried haplogroup E1b1b, a lineage linked to the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages. And that early Bronze Age sample was specifically within 2700 through 2500 BCE. And the Ebelite language, of course, Ebelite language, archaic Semitic language, probably the most ancient to survive in substantial form, dating from the 3rd quarter of the 3rd millennium BC. As a North Central Semitic language, Ebelite is affiliated with the Afro-Asiatic family of languages. And this is from In Hot Pursuit of Language from Prehistory, and it reads, most of the Afro-Asiatic speakers shared the lineage defined by Yap descendant called PN2/215/M35. And here is that Ebla sample that had E. It is E-L795, and it dates from 4600 through 3800 years before present. So that's basically the early Bronze Age. The Ebla EMBA, and that stands for the Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age sample, is genetically connected to ancient southern Levantines, and the ancient southern Levant being the Epipaleolithic to the Bronze Age. And it reads, this is from Genetic History of Neolithic to Bronze Age Anatolia, Northern Levant, and Southern Caucasus. And the relevant portion for us is the section right here that is in yellow. Alalak, Middle Late Bronze Age, and Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age, that's our focus, Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age, are still distinct from the other Anatolian groups with respect to their connection to the ancient southern Levant. So basically, Alalak and Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age samples are distinct. They're not the same as Anatolian groups. But the Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age sample has connections to the ancient southern Levant. And now we're going to go to the actual page that actually shows it when it comes to who they're connected to. But we have one more reading before we get to that. While Alalak Middle Late Bronze Age and Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age requires a substantial contribution from ancient southern Levantine populations. So again, Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age has more of a contribution from the ancient southern Levantine populations. So let's deal with that. So this is what they're talking about. This is the southern Levant Epipaleolithic through the Bronze Age. And the Ebla sample is a gray box. Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age, which is right here. And it's closest, as you can see, to the southern Levant Epipaleolithic through Bronze Age, ancient southern Levant. And by the way, here's all the different triangles and circles and boxes, basically pink, purple, blue colors. And it has like Levant Neolithic, Levant Epi-Paleolithic, different time periods. That's why they said Epi-Paleolithic through Bronze Age. And the Ebla sample is closest to that. So just to give you a visual reference. This makes a lot of sense, and it's powerful information. Here's why. Basically, Ebla early Middle Bronze Age is genetically linked to the Natufians and Neolithic Levantine populations. Why? Well, number one, ancient southern Levant Epi-Paleolithic to Bronze Age would be Natufian. Two, Natufian ancestry is in Syria, where Ebla was. Three, Natufians are believed to be the ancestors of Sémites, which would include the Ebla early Middle Bronze Age sample. Four, this can explain why we see haplogroup E in Ebla as well. In archaeology, the Epi-Paleolithic is a term for a period occurring between the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic during the Stone Age. Mesolithic also falls between those two periods, and the two are sometimes confused or used as synonymous. The Natufian culture is a late Epi-Paleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant, so Natufian does fit within that time frame. And of course, the area of Natufian culture is in the Levant, stretching from the southern Levant to the northern Levant, where Ebla would actually be. Same thing with Proto-Semites as well, stretching from the southern Levant to the northern Levant. The Natufian culture, and by the way, here's a chart of the distribution of Natufian DNA, but the Natufian culture is an Epi-Paleolithic culture that existed from 12,500 to 9,500 BC in the Levant. The Natufian culture is the name given to the sedentary late Epi-Paleolithic hunter-gatherers living in the Levant region of the Near East between about 12,500 and 10,200 years ago. The Natufians foraged for food such as wheat, barley, and almonds, and hunted gazelle, deer, cattle, horses, and wild boar. The descendants of the Natufian, known as Pre-Pottery Neolithic or PPN, were among the first farmers on the planet. And that's what we were talking about earlier, those PPNB populations and Harithian populations basically coming from Natufians. Natufians spawned those PPNB populations, those pre-Pottery Neolithic populations are descendants of Natufians. And of course, from those pre-Pottery Neolithic populations would come the Proto-Semites. The earliest farmers from the Levant, who were the culmination of the sedentary and complex hunter-gatherer culture of the Natufians, spread mostly southward and southwestward into Africa, and were apparently encroached in their own homeland by Anatolian, Iranian, and Caucasian farmers as they expanded, though it preserves high percentages in the southern Levant, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. And by the way, that is our main focus, the southern Levant, because this is where those Eblite samples are genetically closest to the ancient southern Levant, and surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, it is the southern Levant that the Natufian ancestry is highest in. Thus, the genetic ancestry derived from or closely related to the Natufians from the Levant is less widespread in the Old World than the Anatolian one, but its geographic expanse is also very remarkable, particularly in Africa. But here, as you can see, is a chart of the distribution of Natufian ancestry. Basically, it's highest in the Middle East, and then it expands into Africa and the Mediterranean. But we do see a high concentration within the southern Levant, and of course also in Arabians and Bedouins and Yemenis and such. Our main focus is that southern Levant because this is who the Ebelites are genetically closest to. And let's keep in mind and remind ourselves of who the Natufians are from a linguistic perspective. This is from Cambridge, and it reads, given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. So again, the Natufians, they would have spoken a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebelite, which is who we're studying, and Akkadian, the other group that we'll touch on here in a second, early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. So again, Natufians, they would have spoken a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. From Proto-Afro-Asiatic would spawn Proto-Semitic, which developed within the Levant and Syria, and some of the early Semitic people coming from Proto-Semitic would be the Ebelites and the Akkadians. And again, what is the Y chromosome of Proto-Afro-Asiatics? The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. That is from Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. And that all fits perfectly. Again, pastoralism beginning with Afro-Asiatic people carrying haplogroup E. And here is just a nice map showing you the migration patterns of haplogroup E. The oldest samples, of course, of haplogroup E are in the Levant, specifically the southern Levant, and then you see them expand northward into places like Syria and other parts of Mesopotamia. And this would basically fit with the Ebla sample. These early Ebelites and Akkadians migrating from the southern Levant into the northern Levant and then expanding into Mesopotamia. And this is basically what the E samples show. Oldest E samples, southern Levant, expand northward, they come younger, and then younger as you go into the Fertile Crescent. And as I showed you, that younger Ebelite sample in the early Bronze Age, and old but also young E samples in the southern Levant. And the paper said that the Ebelite sample has connections to the ancient southern Levant. That will be your Natufians. So it all plays out perfectly and makes sense. And of course, here's the distribution of Levantine Neolithic ancestry, and it's basically concentrated in the Middle East, as I said, and it's also concentrated in the Levant, Syria, Israel, Jordan, as well as even in Iraq, and of course it's going to be in Arabia and northern Africa and the Mediterranean. But our focus is here, where basically you had these early Semitic peoples concentrate in this part of the world, highest Natufian ancestry in the Levant as it expands outward. This proves that early Proto-Semitic populations truly were genetically Natufian in ancient times. And of course, that would make sense. You still have, to this day in the 21st century, populations in the Middle East that have high amounts of Natufian ancestry, like Arabians and Bedouins and Yemenis. So obviously, you have people in ancient times, early Proto-Semitic populations with a connection to Natufians as well. Since this Ebelite early Middle Bronze Age sample had ancient southern Levant Epipaleolithic connections, this genetic relationship likely also even extends to the Akkadians, since Akkadians also come from the Levant. Remember, Akkadians, they come from the Levant too, and they too would have carried the haplogroup E marker just like the Ebelites. Furthermore, Ebla early Middle Bronze Age, that sample may represent other northern Mesopotamians, specifically Semitic Mesopotamians. And just to recap on the origins of the Akkadians, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, 5,750 years before present, in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. So early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Levant in 3750 BC, and Akkadians will be expanding from the Levant into Mesopotamia. That is from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages, identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. And this fits with the migration of Semites, like Akkadians and early Semites, having haplogroup E. The most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration in the Fertile Crescent, with TMRCAs fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples, are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12, with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-FGC 14382 TMRCAs 2200 BCE and E-V3262 TMRCAs 2600 BCE. That is from the paper How Eurasia Was Born. And again, just showing you the map of haplogroup E expanding into Mesopotamia. It basically fits the same migration patterns and the same migration and time period that Semites would have been expanding from the Levant into Mesopotamia. So it all fits. And this paper will illustrate that unsampled northern Mesopotamian samples could basically be related to or have the genetic makeup of the people of Ebla. This is from Genomic History of Neolithic to Bronze Age Anatolia, Northern Levant, and Southern Caucasus, and it reads, taking the above into consideration, we suggest that the ancestries we inferred for Alalak and Ebla might best describe the genetic makeup of the early Bronze Age populations of unsampled northern Mesopotamia. So other northern Mesopotamian peoples could basically be genetically similar to Ebla, and as I just illustrated, the Ebla sample is genetically related to who? Ancient southern Levantines, Epi-Paleolithic Levantines, which would be Natufians, that Natufian or Neolithic Levantine ancestry. Other northern Mesopotamians could have that. And who would these other northern Mesopotamians be? It would be likely Semitic populations, because of course Ebla was a Semitic kingdom. So here is a map of Ebla, again genetically linked to basically Natufians, and here is the Akkadian Empire, the area where the Akkadian people were, and they too likely will be genetically similar to Ebla, with Ebla basically being an extension of Akkadians to a certain extent, both being East Semitic peoples. And of course, both Ebla and Akkadians come from the Levant, so they genetically probably both were Natufian or genetically linked to the ancient Epi-Paleolithic southern Levant. Again, this actually would fit the Levant Neolithic map when it comes to the distribution of Levantine Neolithic ancestry. It basically fits, and when you think about it, this Levantine Neolithic DNA really doesn't go, the percentages don't go too high above Syria and Iraq. It really just is either non-existent or very, very low. But this Levantine Neolithic DNA is considerably high in Syria and Iraq and everything south of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, which kind of makes sense because this is really the area of ancient Semites. So again, just a reminder, while Alalak, Middle Late Bronze Age, and Ebla, Early Middle Bronze Age, required a substantial contribution from ancient Southern Levant populations. What are those Southern Levant populations? Southern Levant, Epi-Paleolithic through Bronze Age. So that's what we're dealing with. And of course, it was the Epi-Paleolithic culture that existed in 12,500 through 9,500 BC in the Levant, the Natufian culture. The Natufian culture is that Epi-Paleolithic culture. And the descendants of the Natufian culture, known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, or PPN, were among the earliest farmers on the planet. So all of this is important to note. And even this map shows that Natufian ancestry being in a higher percentage in Syria and Iraq compared to places like Anatolia or Iran. The Natufian DNA is basically highest below Syria and Iraq, of course being high in the southern Levant, in Arabia, and in Africa, as well as the Mediterranean. And just to show you, even when it comes to this map, just want to re-illustrate right here, its previous high percentages in the southern Levant, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. That's where you see some of the highest percentages in the southern Levant, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan when it comes to the distribution of Natufian DNA. And again, even this map shows Syria and Iraq would have higher Natufian DNA compared to people in Anatolia or Iran, and the highest percentage of this Natufian DNA is seen in the southern Levant right here, and also in Arabia, and it expands out into Africa and the Mediterranean. And this is who the Ebolite sample was related to, and this is who even the Akkadians would likely be related to as well. Akkadians will also likely have this Natufian ancestry, this Neolithic Levantine ancestry. So Ebolites, Akkadians, and early Proto-Semitic populations likely were both genetically Natufian and carried haplogroup E. However, everything changed in 2000 through 18,000 BC. Ebla was attacked, destroyed, and conquered by the ancient Hurrians. This is when we see the introduction of haplogroup J and Iran/Caucasian DNA into the region. Genetic overturn took place within the northern Levant. According to ancient DNA analysis conducted by Sark or Tanyati et al. 2020 on 10 human remains from Tel Marduk, the inhabitants of the kingdom of Ebla were a mixture of Levantines, that would be your E sample, Iranians, and Anatolians. One early Bronze Age individual carried haplogroup E1B1B, a lineage closely linked to the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages, that would be that Levantine sample, while 4 Middle Bronze Age individuals carried haplogroups G, J1, and T. And these Middle Bronze Age samples would be from 2000 through 18,000 BC. And again, they carried haplogroups G, J1, and T. And so this paper, again, will illustrate that genetic turnover that took place. And we're going to read what's in blue and yellow. We find that mid-6th millennium populations from north/central Anatolia and the southern Caucasian lowlands were closely linked. They formed a genetic gradient cline that runs from western Anatolia to the southern Caucasus and Zagros in today's northern Iran. This cline formed after an admixture event that biologically connected these two regions circa 6500 BCE. Chalcolithic and Bronze Age populations across Anatolia also match descendant from these genetic gradients. So basically, from the Caucasus to Iran to Anatolia, these populations were pretty much genetically very similar to each other, and there was always mixing between those populations. But here's where things change. In the northern Levant, by contrast, we identified a major genetic shift between the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age periods. So there was a major genetic shift in the northern Levant. During this transition, northern Levantine populations experienced gene flow from new groups harboring ancestries related to both Zagros/Caucasus and the southern Levant. So new groups started to come into the northern Levant, and they had a genetic ancestry close to the Zagros/Caucasus. And that's very interesting and important to note. Genetic turnover in the Bronze Age Northern Levant. Genetic turnover in the Bronze Age Northern Levant. The Northern Levant, represented by sites Tel Kardu, Ebla, and Alalak, showcases the most noticeable genetic turnover among are 4 transects within 2 millennia after the last Middle Chalcolithic Tel Kurdu individual, the genetic profile of the populations in and around Akum Valley changed to largely resemble contemporaneous Anatolians. And that's very interesting. And our main focus is Ebla. I'm going to read these other sites where you see genetic turnover just to really illustrate this large mass of new groups coming in. So we see that in Tel Kurdu, that population changed, and genetically they started to look like Anatolians, contemporaneous Anatolians. So an Anatolian population came in. That's very interesting. However, the QPADM modeling with Berukhaya-EC suggests that Alalak Middle Late Bronze Age and Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age are still distinct from the other Anatolian groups with respect to their connection to the ancient southern Levant. So basically, keeping our focus on Ebla, the Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age are not like the Anatolian groups. These Ebla samples, which would be Semitic samples, are genetically not like the Anatolian groups. They're distinct from them. And again, these Ebla samples have a connection to the ancient southern Levant, which would be your Natufians. Now let's finish what the paper says. It says, in addition, Barsin-N/Tel Kurdu-EC and /or ancient Caucasian groups cannot successfully model Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age and Alalak in QPADM, suggesting that these sources do not represent good proxies of their true ancestry. So basically, to sum up all that jargon, the ancient Caucasian groups cannot be successfully modeled for the Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age. Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age samples are not ancient Caucasians genetically. They don't represent good proxies for their true ancestries. And again, basically illustrating that these early Semitic populations would not have been ancient Caucasians from a genetic perspective. And this fits with the downfall of Ebla, because who are these groups coming in that are causing, again, genetic turnover in the Bronze Age Northern Levant? Who are these groups that are causing all of this? It would be the Hurru Hittites, or specifically just Hurrians in general. This is a book called Ebelitica, Essays on the Ebla Archives and Ebelite Language, and it details the destruction of Ebla by the Hurrians. So it reads, the Hurru Hittite bilingual clearly ascribes the destruction of Ebla to Hurrians. All of the names of Ebla's adversaries, Pura, Pezra'ara, Arabi Ibla, Peleb Ibla, and Esi Pa'u are Hurrian. And forgive me for any mispronunciations of those Hurrian names. The Hurrians moved from Trans-Tigris to northern Mesopotamia, and from northern Mesopotamia to northern Syria. And what does that fit? Genetic turnover in the Bronze Age northern Levant. Northern Syria, that's where the northern Levant will be. Genetic turnover in the Bronze Age northern Levant. This is when all of this is taking place. Again, we're going to read that. The Hurrians moved from Trans-Tigris to northern Mesopotamia, and from northern Mesopotamia to northern Syria, as evident by the role of cities in these regions with divine residences, or by deified avatars of pantheon deities revered by the Hurrians in northern Syria and Anatolia. And that fits perfectly with what this genetic study said about how genetic turnover was happening in the northern Levant in the Bronze Age, and you saw these groups basically, well, genetically turning over the local populations, and then these populations begin to have, again, resemble contemporaneous Anatolians, and again, ancient Caucasian groups, which the Hurrians would be Anatolian Caucasian populations. Immediately after the takeover of Ebla, its new ruler ordered the construction of the great earth rampart around the city. And that's another thing I think is pretty important that y'all should note, is that when Ebla was taken over, it wasn't just destroyed and the Hurrians left. They destroyed it. They destroyed Ebla, but then they also lived in Ebla. They like rebuilt Ebla. So don't think of it as being destroyed and then the Hurrians left. No, they destroyed it and then they rebuilt it. So let's reread this section. Immediately after the takeover of Ebla, its new ruler ordered the construction of the great earth rampart around the city, a point in time made certain by the presence of shards of Merdek to be 2 pottery, but not any from Merdek 3a, and the rubble particularly used for its erection. The rebuilt Ebla once again became a great and prosperous city. During the Middle Bronze Age I, it was ruled by a dynasty that was not Amorite as presumed, but Hurrian. Again, Hurrians ruling Ebla in the Middle Bronze Age. It became Amorite in the political sense of the word only at the beginning of the Middle Bronze II, when it was taken over by the kingdom of Yamhad. And check out my old videos that deal with Yamhad, because Yamhad was also particularly heavily populated by Hurrians. The wave of destruction in northern Syria, which again, that fits perfectly with this genetic overturn in the Bronze Age, northern Levant, which will include Syria, where Ebla was. So, the wave of destruction in northern Syria. It was customary among archaeologists to synchronize the end of early Bronze Age 4b in Syria with the downfall of the Ur-3 Empire, given or taken a few decades. The destruction of Ebla 2b2 fit well into the time frame. Moreover, it was noted that Ebla was not alone in having been destroyed then. So, again, that's another thing that I want to stress, is that Ebla was not the only city to be destroyed in this time. There was various other ancient Semitic cities that were destroyed. Ebla was not alone in the destruction. As stated by Matani, it is very difficult to fix the exact date of this tragic event. As I have already said, the 2000 BC dating is purely formal. On the other hand, comparative evidence from other contemporary centers of the Syrian area, all of which from the Akwum to Hama, show the same destruction. So from Akwum to Hamath, we see the same type of destruction. Let's finish. It says, indicates that the catastrophe which overwhelmed the late Proto-Syrian culture, the late first, proto means first, the late first Proto-Syrian culture, must in any case be dated in the various upper Syrian cities which were destroyed by it between 2050 and 1950 BC. So basically the area in question that we are looking at for the wave of destruction in northern Syria is 2050 through 1950 BC. This is when a lot of the late Proto-Syrian cities, the upper Syrian cities, were being destroyed. And we know the perpetrators, those who were destroying these Syrian cities, were the Hurrian peoples who came from further north of Mesopotamia in the Caucasus. So what's interesting about the destruction of Ebla by the Hurrians is that it happened around the same time of the destruction of the Akkadian Empire by the Gutians. And the Gutians themselves may have been Hurrians as well. So here is a timeline of Akkad. This is from the World History Encyclopedia. So 2334 BCE through 2279 BCE, Sargon of Akkad the Great reigns over Mesopotamia and thus creates the world's first empire. Then, when we get to 2218 BCE through 2047 BC, the Gutian period in Sumer. That's the Gutian period in Sumer, 2218 BC through 2040 BC. And then when we get to 2193 BC, this is when we see the Gutian invasion. The Gutian invasion actually destroys the Akkadian Empire in 2193 BC. And then once we get to 2083 BCE, this is the fall of Akkad to the Gutians, the end of the Akkadian Empire. That is in 2083 BC. The fall of Akkad to the Gutians and the end of the Akkadian Empire. And then from 2083 BC through 2050 BC, that's considered the Dark Age of Mesopotamia, because a lot of wars and conquerors and a lot of the Semites didn't like that time period. They considered it a dark age because they were being ruled over by non-Semitic foreigners that they considered to be barbarians. And what's interesting about this time, again, from 2193 BC with the Gutian invasion that destroys the Akkadian Empire, and then in 2083 BC we see the fall of Akkad to the Gutians and the end of the Akkadian Empire. This all fits around when? The exact same time period where in Syria we see that the upper cities were destroyed between 2050 and 1950 BC. So it's, like I said, it's all happening around the same time, and the perpetrators remain the same. It was the destruction of Ebla to the Hurrians. Ebla's adversaries were the Hurrians, and we see that with Akkad, it is these Gutians. So just to refresh on who are the Gutians, this is from ancient Egypt and the Near East, and it reads, during the last years of the Akkadian Empire, there were many incursions by fierce tribesmen from the southeast carrying out hit-and-run raids. These intruders were the Gutians, one of many peoples living in the Zagros Mountains. These raids plundered the rich cities of the Mesopotamian plain and were already long gone before any army could arrive to confront them. The Gutians pillaged all over the Akkadian Empire, although they occupied only a few remote regions. Finally, they destroyed Akkad itself. So Akkad fell to these Gutian peoples who may be related to the Hurrians. This is from Encyclopedia of the Peoples of Africa and the Middle East, and it reads, the Halaf period was followed by the Hurrian period from 2600 to 6300 years ago, which was based in Mesopotamia and the Zagros-Tartarus mountain area of Iran. The Hurrian peoples spoke a language related to modern Chechenian. And check out my video on the Chechenians. I actually have a video that details who they are, and several videos about Chechenians in English. But the Hurrian peoples spoke a language related to modern Chechenian. The Hurrians, in fact, comprised a number of clans and subclans, probably not Indo-European in origin. That's because they're Caucasian. They dominated the area now known as Kurdistan, as well as Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Sumerian writings dating to around 3000 BCE referred to the land of the Khorda or Khorda and the people living there as the Khordoshi and the Guti and other variants. These are thought to be the earliest written references to the peoples who would become known as Kurds. And I also have a video on the Kurdish and Hurrian connections as well if you want to check that out. But here is basically the area in question. Here's a map of the Guti, who will be the Gutians, again, in above the Tigris and Euphrates River in the Zagros Mountains. Then here's the Hurrians, who are in southern Caucasus, from Anatolia to Iran to Armenia. And here's just a visual representation of everything. The Zagros mountain range, where these Gutians would come from and invade the Mesopotamian plain where the Akkadians were, as well as the Hurrians, who are concentrated in Anatolia and the southern Caucasus, that will come into Syria and attack Ebla. So all these ethnic groups will be right here. So the civilizations of Akkad and Ebla collapsed by the same ethnic group of people around the same time. Also, around the same time was the period of great climatic change. In a sense, you can consider this to be climate change, called the 4.2 BP event. This is when Mesopotamia was experiencing a lot of change in the environment, which could have caused these northern populations in the Tigris, upper Tigris River, and in the Zagros Mountains and Tartarus Mountains. These climatic events could have caused them to migrate into Mesopotamia because of all of this major change that was going on. This is from Genetic History of Neolithic to Bronze Age Anatolia, Northern Levant, and the Southern Caucasus, and it reads, consequently, these interpretive caveats call for consideration of alternative historical scenarios, including scenarios of multiple gene flow events that could have taken place in the intervening 2 millennia between the Tel Kardu population and those of Bronze Age Ebla and Alalak. However, written sources, archaeological, and paleoclimatic evidence suggests that a narrower time period, the end of the early Bronze Age, had been very critical with respect to political tensions and population mobility. It was during this period, for example, that Ebla was destroyed twice and re-established at the beginning of Middle Bronze Age. There are extensive textual references from the end of the early Bronze Age through the late Bronze Age, referring to groups of people arriving into the area of the Akhum Valley. So all this is starting to make sense now. We have textual evidence of different groups coming in. And let's finish what it says. It says, although these groups were named, likely based on designations, e.g. Amorites, Hurrians, again, we're back with the Hurrians, they're part of these new groups of people, the formative context of their cultural identity and their geographic origins remains debated. One recent hypothesis associates the arrival of these groups with climate-forced population movement during the 4.2K before present event, a mega drought that led to the abandonment of the entire Kabir River Valley in northern Mesopotamia and the search of nearby habitable areas. And so that's another important factor that we should keep in mind, is that when these Hurrian groups in northern Caucasian, Anatolian, and Iranian populations were coming into Mesopotamia, yes, there was much warfare and these people were conquering and taking over land, but a large reason for this is because of major drought that was going on in the homeland of these Hurrians, and so they were trying to find a better place to live, and the best place was the Fertile Crescent. I mean, it's literally in the name, the Fertile Crescent. They fled there, and of course there was already Semites there, Akkadians, Ebelites, and they just wiped them out, or they assimilated, or they conquered them, and stayed in those regions. And again, because of a lot of climatic change. And it's very similar to the late Bronze Age collapse, where you have the same thing happen with the Sea Peoples, a lot of Greek Balkan peoples coming into the other side of the Mediterranean in the Near East and North Africa because of a lot of climate change with the Bronze Age collapse, and of course a lot of warfare followed shortly after. So it's basically the same thing. Also, another similarity is with even the Vikings. They left because of different reasons and came and conquered other lands that weren't far from them. So these Hurrians are basically doing the same thing, leaving, going into new lands, conquering the people because of things going on in their own homeland. And this fits exactly with even the Akkadian study that I've read in the past. This is from the continuity and admixture in the last 5 millennia of Levantine history from ancient Canaanite and present-day Lebanese genome sequences. And it reads, the admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian collapse is argued to have been the result of a widespread aridification event around 4,200 years ago. And that fits perfectly with what happened even with Ebla and of course other sites around the region, this 4.2K BP event. So it's the same time period, it's the same type of thing going on. And so it says the Akkadian collapse is argued to have been the result of a widespread aridification event around 4,200 years ago, probably caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. And who are these northern refugees? It's likely the Hurrians, like we covered thus far. So I'm going to read that again. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. So you had northern refugees migrate to the south, where the Sémites are, and of course villages and cities became too populated. And that fits perfectly with what this study says as well. Two separate studies covering two different populations of people, basically saying the same thing. The Eblites being Semites in Syria, having the same type of destruction happen to them, and Akkadian people having the same type of destruction happening to them around the same time and by the same people. And now let's just finish what it says. So future sampling of ancient DNA from northern Syria and Iraq may reveal if these migrants carried the Iranian Chalcolithic related ancestry we observe in Bronze Age Sidon and Jordan. And of course we read papers that basically confirm that yes, these migrants carried Iranian DNA, and we'll cover that here in a second. But again, let's even look at it from an archaeological standpoint, because this paper doesn't deal anything with DNA, it just deals with the movement and migration of the core Araxes culture and people. So it reads, Kohlholl also reminds us of the evidence of increased militarism from the early to the late Bronze Age that is reflected in more fortified sites, new weaponry, and an iconography of war as seen on the Khrushchev Cup. So that's very fascinating because we see that there was a lot of increased militarism in the early Bronze Age. There's a lot of warfare, fortified sites, new type of weapons, and just, depictions of war itself. And this is all happening in the early Bronze Age. Kohlholl argues that while the number of core Araxes settlements decreased in the southern Caucasus, archaeological research indicates that the core Araxes culture spread to western Iran and the Zagros region and to the Levant. So again, these migrants, these people who are starting to move about, are from the core Araxes culture, because we see that these sites are decreasing, these settlements are decreasing in the southern Caucasus, and these people are appearing in Iran and also eventually in the Levant. So it fits that migration that was illustrated here, where we see archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities became and villages became overpopulated. So continuing this study, it says, in Kohlholl's view, these new groups of people moved in the core Araxes communities, abandoned the southern Caucasus, and moved further south, where some of them already resided. I'm going to read that again. In Kohlholl's view, these new groups of people moved in the Core-Araxes communities abandoned the southern Caucasus and moved further south where some of them already resided. So again, these are new groups of people and they're migrating, and that fits perfectly with what the genetics studies say about these new groups of people coming into the Levant and basically creating a genetic turnover. I'm going to read this right here. Starting in yellow, the last sentence. In the northern Levant, by contrast, we identified a major genetic shift between the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age periods. During this transition, northern Levantine populations experienced gene flow from new groups, keyword, new groups, harboring ancestries related to both Zagros/Caucasus and the southern Levant. So these new groups of people had gene flow from the Zagros and the Caucasus, and that fits perfectly with what's being said here. And just to read the last part, it says others associate the cultures of the post-Core-Araxes period, especially in Traleti culture, with movement of people from the Near East, possibly the expansion of Hurrian tribes. So we know the basic people who's causing this genetic turnover in the northern Levant, who's causing this collapse of the Akkadian and Eblaite civilizations. It is the people of the Core-Araxes culture, and the people from the Core-Araxes culture are the Hurrians. It's the expansion of these Hurrian tribes. And so the civilizations of Akkad and Ebla collapsed by northern populations like Core-Araxes Hurrians around the 4.2 BP event, where there was much climate change and warfare. And this leads to my next point. Further evidence as to why haplogroup J isn't Semitic in origin. Haplogroup J isn't Proto-Semitic in origin, as well as further evidence why Armenian/Anatolian/Iranian/Caucasian DNA isn't Semitic in origin, if you haven't figured it out already just by reading this alone. I'm going to further explain why haplogroup J and this Caucasus Iranian DNA can't be Proto-Semitic in origin. So let's get into that. The destruction of Semitic civilization. So further evidence as to why haplogroup J and Armenian, Anatolian, Iranian, and Caucasian DNA isn't Semitic in origin is because of this. Point number one, genetic differences. There is a clear genetic difference between the local Semitic inhabitants of Ebla, the Ebla early Middle Bronze Age, and the new groups that come into the land carrying Iran/Caucasian/Anatolian ancestry. Remember, let's read what's in yellow. Start right here. During the late Chalcolithic and/or the early Bronze Age, more than half of the northern Levantine gene pool was replaced, while the rest of the Anatolia and the southern Caucasus, we document genetic continuity with other transit gene flow. Overall, our study uncovers multiple scales of population dynamics through time, from extensive admixture during the Neolithic period to long-distance mobility within the globalized societies of the late Bronze Age. But the key thing to keep in mind is this, which is in yellow. During the late Chalcolithic and/or the early Bronze Age, more than half of the northern Levantine gene pool was replaced. So this goes to show you that something happened, something changed, when the northern Levantine gene pool was replaced. This is a new group of people coming in and replacing the local people that were there. Because if it were the same people, then nothing would really change. It was a different group of people with a different genetic background that came in. Again, from the genetic turnover in the Bronze Age northern Levant, reading what's in yellow. The northern Levant, represented by the sites Tel Kurdu, Ebla, and Alalak, showcase the most noticeable genetic turnover among our 4 time transects. So we see that there was genetic change, genetic turnover in these locations of the northern Levant, and we're going to focus specifically on Ebla, but I do want to make it known that here in yellow it says changed to largely resemble contemporary Anatolians. This area that changed was the Tel Kurdu population. But it even says now here, in addition, when it comes to these populations or the ancient Caucasian groups, cannot successfully model Ebla early Middle Bronze Age and Alalak Middle Late Bronze Age, suggesting that these sources do not represent good proxies of true ancestries. So we see that when it comes to ancient Caucasian groups, they cannot be successfully modeled for the Ebla population because the Ebla population isn't Caucasian. And this illustrates that the local population, which would have been Semitic, is not the same as these new groups coming in, which would be people carrying Iranian and Caucasian DNA. As examined here, most LC-LBA groups are adequately modeled by adding the second ancestry of ancient Iran/Caucasus populations, while Alalak Middle Late Bronze Age and Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age require a substantial contribution from ancient Southern Levantine populations. So basically we have one group of people that are more genetically related to ancient Southern Levantines, basically Natufians, and another group of people related to ancient Iranian/Caucasian groups. And we know that it's this Iranian/Caucasian populations that's coming in to places like Ebla. There are new groups, there are the new population of people coming in, which means that they previously wasn't there. And we know that the Ebla populations are Semitic, having ancient Southern Levantine DNA, which basically illustrates that the ancient Proto-Semites would have had DNA more linked to the ancient Southern Levantines, to Natufians, rather than having DNA related to the ancient Iran/Caucasus groups, because they are the ones who are destroying these Semitic city-states. And I just want to illustrate that the Ebla Early Middle Bronze Age is genetically related to the ancient Southern Levant, basically Epi-Paleolithic Southern Levantines, which equals Natufians. And again, just showing you the chart, these are the Ebla samples connected to Southern Levant Epi-Paleolithic through Bronze Age, which is all these Levantine populations. And of course, the Epi-Paleolithic culture is the Natufian culture, which fits with the distribution of Natufian ancestry, which is seen in Syria and in the Southern Levant. And it is the Southern Levant that has the highest percentage of this Natufian ancestry in Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. And the Ebla sample is connected closest to the Southern Levantine populations, the ancient Southern Levantine populations. And this fits perfectly with what we see when it comes to the distribution of Levantine Neolithic DNA, basically in the same areas of where the Semites were in the early Bronze Age in Syria and in Iraq, but not really going into Anatolia and Iran and the Caucasus, because it's these populations who are coming into the Levant and into Mesopotamia. And this is where you pretty much don't really see any Natufian DNA. The new groups that come into the northern Levant and cause this genetic turnover carried Iran/Caucasian DNA. So let's read that. Caucasian hunter-gatherers seem to have managed to avoid population displacement or even extensive replacement by expanding agriculturalists. They mixed with Anatolians, most of all, Iranians and Levantines, to form agricultural societies that still had a lot of native Caucasian ancestry, which may indicate that they transitioned successfully to a Neolithic way of life since early enough that the incoming farmers couldn't simply drive them out or breed them out or outbreed them. Since it's hard to identify ancestry derived from Neolithic Caucasian farmers because they had already mixed with Anatolians, Levantines, and Iranians, the best way to measure the expansion of people from Caucasia is the basis of the Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry. So here is basically where the highest proportion of Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry is. Obviously, it's going to be in the Caucasus. Then it expands into Anatolia, Iran, and goes into Syria, Iraq, and into the Levant, and a little bit into northern Africa, and of course into the Mediterranean. But here's the key thing that we are to focus on, is that this Caucasian DNA is expanding from the north to the south, and this fits perfectly with what we're reading when it comes to this Iranian Caucasian DNA that comes into Ebla. So this map actually details it when it comes to the modern distribution. Now let's get into the Iranian type of DNA that expands as well. This says the least successful in geographic expansion from the Neolithic Revolution onwards seems to have been the genetic admixture derived from Neolithic Iranian farmers, who were extremely distinct genetically from the Anatolian and Levantine farmers at first, before widespread mixing throughout the Neolithic and Chalcolithic eras, 5,000 through 10,000 years ago, but close to the Mesolithic natives from the Caucasus. So basically, the Iranian genome is genetically closer to people of the Caucasus and not genetically close to Levantine farmers, which makes sense. And we see the distribution. The highest proportion of this Iranian DNA is going to be, of course, in Iran, and it expands into India and Pakistan, and that makes sense because of the Aryan invasion. And it also goes into the Middle East. We see this Iranian DNA pop up, which makes sense because of the studies that we've been reading that talk about ancient Iranians coming into places like Ebla and even into the Levant, and we see it expand throughout parts of the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and even northern Africa. And here is yet again another map just detailing this Iranian DNA, this Neolithic Iranian DNA or ancient Iranian DNA, and it's concentrated again highest in Iran and expands into the Middle East, much like how the studies are saying that this Iranian DNA comes in, but it is foreign. These are new groups of people, and this is the modern distribution of people who have it today. And again, here is Iranian Chalcolithic DNA, highest in Iran, and expands into the Middle East. So you can see a clear difference between the Ebla early Middle Bronze Age ancient Southern Levant, which is basically Natufian, and the Iranian/Caucasian groups. So again, here is the Natufian or Neolithic Levantine DNA, its modern distribution, and here is the Iranian DNA and its distribution. And as we can see, the Natufian ancestry is highest in the Middle East, in Northern Africa and Eastern Africa, whereas the Iranian DNA is, of course, highest in Iran, Pakistan, and India, but it does expand into the Middle East as well. Here's another map, again, the Natufian DNA, highest basically from Syria and Iraq on downwards into the Levant, into Arabia, and North Africa and East Africa, whereas the Iranian DNA is highest in Iran, the Caucasus, even goes into Anatolia, and expands outwards into Arabia and Northern Africa. Of course, it's also high in Pakistan and India. So the best ancestry to represent the ancestors of Semites would be the Natufians. Natufians are actually believed to be the ancestors of Semites after all. Furthermore, Natufians carried haplogroup E. This is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it reads, "This paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a key link between the Levant and Africa." And that is from the paper Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus Reveals Core of West Eurasian Ancestry. So it would seem like early Proto-Semites in ancient times never really traveled much or at all beyond the Tigris and Euphrates River in places like the southern Caucasus. Semites pretty much remained in the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Arabia. And this fits perfectly with what we find with the distribution of Natufian ancestry and haplogroup E. So again, Neolithic Levantine DNA, as I said before, pretty much stops in Syria and Iraq. Doesn't really go much into Anatolia, Iran, and the Caucasus. And if it does, it's at very low percentages. But the Levantine Neolithic DNA pretty much goes from Syria and Iraq into the Levant and Arabia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. And this fits perfectly with the distribution of Semitic languages, actually. Semitic languages also pretty much stop in Syria and Iraq. And of course, they go into the Levant and Arabia and even into Egypt, or Northern Africa, should I say. Whereas Semitic languages basically really stop in Turkey, the Caucasus, and Iran, which of course, ironically or, unironically, we see the Caucasian and Iranian DNA highest in. And of course, by the way, here's Ebla, which would be in Syria. And again, all this fits perfectly with the distribution of the Levantine Neolithic DNA. I find that to be fascinating, very fascinating. And of course, here is the ancient territory of Ebla, as well as the ancient territory of the Akkadian Empire. And like I said before, it pretty much stops in the Tigris and Euphrates River, which is basically where you see the Levantine Neolithic DNA stopping in the Tigris and Euphrates River of Iraq and Syria. And this is where the Semitic languages also stop. They don't really go above Syria and Iraq, just like the Neolithic Levantine DNA, and just like the Ebelite and the Akkadian Empire. So it all overlaps perfectly. Everyone above Mesopotamia was typically non-Semitic people, both in ancient times and even today, which fits even with the distribution of Iranian/Caucasian ancestry. Haplogroup J also seems to be associated with ancient Iranian/Caucasian ancestry. Again, here is the area in question, the Iranian Chalcolithic DNA. And as I said, highest in Iran, goes into the Caucasus, goes into Anatolia, and today now it's of course seen in the Middle East, but the highest percentage is in Iran. And interestingly enough, this is also where you see a lot of these non-Semitic people. You have the Hattic language, you have the Caucasian languages, you have the Hurru-Uratrian languages, you have the Kassites, you have even the Gutians who conquered the Akkadians, and of course the Hurru-Uratrians that conquered the Ebelite people. And you have all the Semitic languages, again, like I said, in Syria and Iraq. It doesn't really go above, they don't really go above Syria and Iraq. Everything south of Syria and Iraq are Semitic speaking peoples, where everything north of Syria and Iraq are non-Semitic speaking peoples. And it's like that even today. It's the exact same type of distribution. In Syria and Iraq, you have the Semitic-speaking peoples, and everything south of it is Semitic as well. But in northern Syria, or above Syria, and above northern modern-day Iraq, is the non-Semitic speaking peoples, like Iranian-speaking peoples, such as the Kurdish peoples. And of course, in Iran, you're going to have Iranian-speaking peoples there too. But this distribution of Semitic-speaking peoples and Iranian-speaking peoples basically all fits with what we see genetically. And also, when it comes to these Iranian-speaking peoples, it fits even with the haplogroup J2 marker, with most of haplogroup J2 being distributed in Anatolia, the Southern Caucasus, Iran, going all the way into India. And so that fits with the branch of Iranian, which is part of the Indo-European language family. And of course, it doesn't go beyond Syria and Iraq. So I find that these parallels, of course, to not be coincidental, and it all lines up. So the Natufian ancestry would be more akin to Proto-Semites, whereas the Iranian ancestry would be more akin to non-Semitic northern populations. Again, just to show you this, the Levantine Neolithic DNA fits and overlaps perfectly with the distribution of Semitic peoples, whereas in Turkey, Southern Caucasus, and Iran, those peoples would mostly carry the Caucasus hunter-gatherer and the Neolithic Iranian DNA. So Iranian/Caucasian ancestry clearly isn't Semitic in origin, and this leads to my second point, point number 2. The Iranian/Caucasian DNA is coming into already established Semitic civilizations. I'm going to read that again. The Iranian/Caucasian DNA is coming into already established Semitic civilizations. Remember, key word is that it was new groups carrying this DNA that came into places like Ebla and the Akkadian Empire and caused genetic turnover. Let me read this again in yellow. In the northern Levant, by contrast, we identified a major genetic shift between the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age periods. During this transition, northern Levantine populations experienced gene flow from new groups, again it's from new groups, harboring ancestries related to both Zagros/Caucasus and southern Levant. So, it was new groups of people harboring ancestries from the Zagros and the Caucasus. Zagros is Iran as well, by the way. And again, just to illustrate, in addition, when it comes to these and the ancient Caucasian groups cannot successfully model Ebla early Middle Bronze Age and Alalak Middle Late Bronze Age, suggesting that these sources do not represent good proxies of true ancestries. So basically the Ebla early Middle Bronze Age samples are not genetically ancient Caucasian groups because it cannot be successfully modeled. And it's the northern Levant represented by the sites Tel Kardu, Ebla, and Alalak showcase the most noticeable genetic turnover among the 4 time transects. So there was genetic turnover in the Bronze Age northern Levant, and it was by populations that were ancient Caucasian groups, as well as contemporary Anatolian groups. And again, this fits even with this paper, a different paper that illustrates the exact same thing. The admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian collapse, is argued to have been the result of a widespread aerification event around 4,200 years ago, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. Future sampling of ancient DNA from northern Syria and Iraq may reveal if these migrants carried the Iranian Chalcolithic related ancestry we observe in Bronze Age Sidon and Jordan. And that's basically what it will come out to be, is that it's these people with Iranian Chalcolithic DNA who are collapsing these Semitic empires. Since this Iranian/Caucasian DNA is coming into already established cities and Semitic civilizations, all of these are new groups coming in and causing genetic turnover. This goes to show you that this Iranian/Caucasian DNA wasn't previously in these established Semitic cities. It wasn't there. These are new people coming in. Therefore, this means that the Semites who were there didn't carry this DNA because it's showing up within the genome as something new. So the Semites didn't have it, or wouldn't show up as something new. They came into Semitic kingdoms, therefore they are the reason for the downfall. That Iranian Caucasian DNA is the literal reason for the downfall of these Semitic cities. And again, like I said, if it's a new genome coming in, and clearly we see that the Ebelite sample isn't related to the ancient Caucasians, then this proves that the Semites were not originally Iranian or Caucasian genetically. Because if they were the same people, then you wouldn't see any change genetically. But we do. And this leads to my next point, my third point. Point number 3, the direction of migration. The direction of migration. This is important. These groups carrying Iran/Caucasian DNA are coming from the north to the south to enter Mesopotamia. The origins of Semites is not in the Caucasus. Semites originate 4000 BC in the Levant and dispersed from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And that is something that is extremely important to note. Again, the origins of Semites is not in the Caucasus or in Iran. Semites originate 4000 BC in the Levant, and they expand from the Levant into Mesopotamia. This is from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages, identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East, and it reads, early Semitic dispersals. Our Semitic language phylogeny indicates that the initial divergence of ancestral Semitic into East and West Semitic was nearly coincident with the divergence of West Semitic into Central and South Semitic around 5,300 years before present. The short interval between these two divergences and their overlapping HPDs suggests that both divergences may have occurred in the northeast Levant. The distribution of ancient and modern Central and South Semitic languages is consistent with Central Semitic spreading westward throughout the Levant and South Semitic spreading southward from the Levant, eventually reaching southern Arabia. So basically, the early dispersal of Semitic languages was from the Levant. South Semitic, Central Semitic, West Semitic, it's all spreading. East Semitic as well, it's all spreading from the Levant. So here is the Semitic dispersals. Again, it's in the Levant. You have Semitic going into Mesopotamia from the Levant. And then you have Semites coming from the Levant into Arabia, as you can see. And so everything, all the Semitic languages come from the Levant, 6,000 YBP. So 6,000 YBP, years before present, will be in 4,000 BCE. So the origin of Semitic, Proto-Semitic, is 4,000 BCE in the Levant, not in the Caucasus, not in Iran. And even Dr. Razib Khan would even say this and confirm this. And I'm going to let him even explain it as well right here. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
There are groups that make claims for E1B1A being a founding haplogroup among Semitic groups. Is E1B1A found in high frequencies among Semitic populations like J1? Would the ancient Arabians and Syrians and the Israelites have had high percentages of E1B1A within their populations in antiquity?
Yeah, they did, but they also had J1. So this is my opinion. So take that for what it is. I think that J1 and J2 probably were not, and I'm going to say Afroasiatic because, like the Egyptians spoke non-Semitic language, but it was Afroasiatic, like more closely related to that of the Amazigh people, the Berbers, right? So North Africa had a different branch before the Semitic whatever. So I'll say Afroasiatic, Semitic, and whatever the other groups like Tuareg and stuff. So it looks like the Natufians had it. It looks like there was a massive admixture between Western and Eastern Levant, Middle Eastern people, probably before 3000 BC, but after, let's say after like 8000 BC, somewhere like in prehistory, there was a genetic exchange, and the J's, J1, J2, seem to show up during that exchange in the Levant and the western part of the Middle East. I don't think Afroasiatic languages are from Western Iran, which is where they would come from. Therefore, I don't think. Also, like you find J2 and J's in Europe and in India, and obviously, and that's not due to Semitic migration, right? So they're ancient lineages that are in like the Indus Valley civilization and what. Excuse me. So I think E is probably more likely to be Afroasiatic. And they had high frequencies in Arabians, Syrians, and Israelites.
Okay.
So Razib Khan said it perfectly and beautifully. Early Afro-Asiatic populations, which would include Semites, they would have had haplogroup E. The J markers would not have been the first Semitic peoples. They would have came into the area of Semitic peoples. And again, Afro-Asiatic Semites, they don't originate from the southern Caucasus, from western Iran. They originate in the Levant, where haplogroup E was always heavily concentrated anyways. So Razib Khan said it perfectly. And going back to this study, just to finish it off, it says, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, 5,750 years before present, in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia, which is what this image right here illustrates. Akkadians coming from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And of course, other Semitic languages being dispersed from the Levant. Again, 6,000 years before present, which is 4,000 BCE. Levant origin of Semites. So Semites had their origin in the Levant in 4000 BC, not the southern Caucasus or Iran. This makes it virtually impossible for Iranian/Caucasian DNA to be the original genome of Semites, and this makes it impossible for haplogroup J to be the original Y-DNA chromosome of Semites. Those groups were moving north-south. Semites were moving south into the north. This leads to my next point. Point number 5. We know exactly who these northern populations are. Historically, the conquerors of Semites were people from the core Araxes culture, specifically the Hurrian tribes that were non-Semitic speakers. They would have carried Iranian/Caucasian DNA as well as haplogroup J. The very paper even illustrates that and says it. It says, starting right here, at the same time during the second half of the 4th millennium BCE, the core Araxes culture, which is generally thought to originate in the southern Caucasus, expanded outward around 3000 through 2900 BCE, spreading westward to eastern Anatolia and the north and central Levant, and eastward to Iran. So the core Araxes culture even expanded into northern and southern Levant. Northern and southern Levant. And this fits with haplogroup J. The Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 TMRCA is 4300 BCE, can be linked to the Armenian highlands and present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the core Araxes culture, 3400 BCE through 2000 BCE. 3 subclades of it, J1-ZS3042 TMRCA is 3500 BCE, J1-ZS5658 TMRCA is 2800 BCE, J1-ZS2872 2800 BCE, and J1-Y5353 TMRCA is 2500 BCE, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggests Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the core Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well, which is what we just read. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So again, Northeast Caucasians, the core Araxes culture, Hurrians, they're all linked to haplogroup J, and the reason for haplogroup J moving into Mesopotamia and even into the ancient Levant. Again, non-Semitic people with these early J markers. So this leads to my basic final point. Haplogroup J passed through Mesopotamia and entered the Levant after the collapse of Semitic civilizations in the Fertile Crescent, such as Ebla and Akkad, in 21,000 through 2000 BC. This is the exact time when haplogroup J entered the Levant in 21,000 BC. We know when haplogroup J entered the Levant, they are carrying the same Iranian DNA. Furthermore, we know the culture and people associated with the J marker in the early Bronze Age Levant. It is the Kerbic-Carrick wire culture, which is an extension of the Cora Araxes culture, a non-Semitic Caucasian culture. Basically, Hurrians, they are the same groups that destroyed Ebla and Akkad. Also, just like the genetic turnover that occurred in the northern Levant, this same genetic turnover happened in the southern Levant with the local population. That local population would have been Semitic. This is from History, World History, Encyclopedia, The Hurrians, and it reads, when the kingdom of Akkad fell, circa 2190 BCE, the Hurrians and others exploited the constant power vacuum in Mesopotamia. So the key thing to keep in mind is this. The kingdom of Akkad fell circa 2190 BCE. So what happened in the Levant in this time? This is the exact same time period we see haplogroup J, the oldest sample of haplogroup J, appear in the Levant. Early Bronze Age, aged estimate 2198 through 1966 BC. The Y S&P J1. Let's go back. When the kingdom of Akkad fell, circa 2190 BCE, the Hurrians and others exploited the constant power vacuum in Mesopotamia. Shortly after the fall of Akkad is when you see J enter into the Levant, 2198 BCE. Not a coincidence. This makes sense because this is the movement of Hurrians. Now the next important factor is to remember this. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. So why is this important? Well, 5,750 years before present is 3750 BC. So Semites were in the Levant in 3750 BC. But haplogroup J, the oldest sample we find, is in 2198 BCE. So basically, haplogroup J is 2,000 years too late to be considered Proto-Semitic. Semites were expanding from the Levant in 4000 BC, but J only enters the Levant in 2198 BC. It is 2,000 years too late to be considered Semitic, but we know haplogroup E was always in the Levant. So this is another reason why it's impossible for J to be Proto-Semitic in origin. It arrives 2,000 years too late. And we know why it arrived and who it was. This is from the Genomic History of the Middle East, and it reads, we found an ancestry related to ancient Iranians that is ubiquitous today in all Middle Easterners. Previous studies show that this ancestry was not present in the Levant during the Neolithic period, but appeared in the Bronze Age, where 50% of the local ancestry was replaced by a population carrying ancient Iran-related ancestry. This population potentially introduced the Y chromosome haplogroup J1 into the region. So J1 entered into the region carrying ancient Iranian DNA. And again, just as Dr. Razib Khan says, and just as many papers say, Proto-Semitic Afroasiatics, they don't originate in Iran or the Caucasus. And this is the opposite direction in which Semites are supposed to be migrating. Furthermore, it is this J1 and Iranian DNA that is collapsing the Semitic cities. And they even come into the Levant and they replace the local ancestry, and that local ancestry would have been Semitic. So here is the Cora Araxes culture, and here's the Semites. There is a clear difference. Genetic difference, linguistic difference, and geographical difference. Semites are in the Levant, Cora Araxes in the southern Caucasus. You have Semites to the south, and you have Cora Araxes to the north. And look at the arrows, and look at where they're pointing to. We have Semites migrating from the south to the north, whereas you have Cora Araxes moving from the north to the south. Furthermore, this is where you will see the Neolithic Levantine and the Natufian ancestry, as well as haplogroup E, dispersed from. And this is where you'll see the Coraxis Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry and Iranian ancestry dispersed from, as well as haplogroup J. So let's see that dispersal. The Coraxis culture will, boom, come into the Levant. And as the paper said, what did it say? Previous studies showed that this ancestry was not present in the Levant during the Neolithic period, but appeared in the Bronze Age, where 50% of the local ancestry, which would have been Semitic, was replaced by a population carrying ancient Iranian-related ancestry. And what happened? This local Semitic ancestry was replaced by the Iranian ancestry, and we can even see this when it comes to culturally, that this Coraxis culture of people came in to the Levant, creating the Kerbek-Kerekwar culture, whereas Semites would move deeper into the Arabian deserts to sort of escape this expansion. So again, Coraxis here, Semites here, and the Coraxis comes in, creating the Kerbek-Kerekwar culture. So who is this culture? This is from Genetics and the Archaeology of Ancient Israel, and it reads, this geographic distribution of J2A versus J1 mirrors the two autosomal components from Habir et al. 2013. However, several demographic and migratorial events may contribute to the observed Y frequency patterns in the southern Levant. Major J2A lineages whose origin is likely from East Anatolia, Armenia, Georgia, and northwest Iran could have migrated to the southern Levant during the early Bronze Age through the movement of the Coraxis horizon to Lebanon, Syria, and ultimately the Galilee area, marked by the Kerbek-Kerekwar culture. So again, haplogroup J is linked to the migration of the Coraxis culture, and they enter into the Levant, creating the Kerbek-Kerekwar culture. So we know who these J markers are. And again, Coraxis culture, non-Semitic culture, non-Semitic people coming from the Southern Caucasus into the Levant, where the Semites already were, and then they just really replaced the local population, which is what the genetic papers say. So let's finish what it says. It says, later immigration from a similar East Anatolian source may have brought Hurrian onomastics to the southern Levant during the Middle Bronze Age. These events may have added J2A to an underlying J1 substratum. So again, haplogroup J, J1, J2, it's linked to this Coraxis Hurrian migration. So we know exactly who these J markers are. They're not Semitic in origin, they are Coraxis and Hurrian in origin. So summary and conclusion. Semites descend from Natufians. Proto-Semites genetically would be Natufian and have the haplogroup E marker. 4000 BC is when Semites migrate from the Levant into Mesopotamia. The Ebla early Middle Bronze Age sample had haplogroup E and was genetically linked to ancient southern Levantines. And the Ebla and Akkadian Semitic empires, they were in Mesopotamia. Then everything changed in 21,000 through 2000 BC, the collapse of Semitic civilization. Hurrians and Gutians migrated south from the north with the expansion of the Coraxis culture. This is when we see the Iranian/Caucasian populations and J1 begin to appear in Mesopotamia / the Levant in 21,000 through 2000 BC, basically the 4.2 BP event. And this is when genetic turnover and genetic replacement occurs by non-Semitic Iranian and Caucasian populations. This is the collapse of Semitic civilization. And here's where we end the destruction of Semitic civilization. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, share the video, click the bell, and leave a comment for any questions you might have. and follow my social media platforms for more information. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.